This is where the mystery begins, not with its existence, but with its disappearance. By the middle of the 19th century, the term Tartaria starts to vanish from maps, as if some unseen hand had reached across the globe and erased it. 100 years later, it is gone entirely from schoolbooks and atlases. Modern history relegates it to a catch-all label Europeans once used for the Eurasian steppe, populated by horse-riding nomads of Turkic and Mongol origin. It was, so the textbooks say, never an empire, merely an outdated geographic term replaced. When Russian imperial expansion and modern exploration charted these lands more precisely, but that neat explanation has never satisfied everyone. If Tartaria was nothing more than a vague placeholder, why were its boundaries drawn so clearly, so consistently, by mapmakers from rival nations with no reason to collude? Why did it feature administrative divisions, cities, even roads? And why the sudden, near-universal decision to stop printing the name altogether? The way it drops from the historical record, quickly, uniformly, without public debate, feels less like the natural evolution of geography and more like the enforcement of a new narrative. Some researchers suggest the answer lies in the politics of empire. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Russia was expanding rapidly eastward, absorbing vast territories. By controlling the maps, the new rulers could control the memory of what came before. Replace Tartaria with Siberia, Turkestan, or simply Russian Empire, and the old identity is dissolved. The French and British, too, had reasons to redraw maps in ways that emphasized their own colonial possessions while downplaying the sovereignty of others. Others pushed the theory further. They claimed Tartaria was not a loose scattering of tribes, but an advanced, multi-ethnic empire with technology and knowledge that rivaled, or even surpassed, our own in certain respects. In this view, its erasure was deliberate, coordinated, across nations, because it represented a competing model of civilization. To acknowledge it would be to admit that humanity had already achieved and lost a kind of global unity and technological sophistication, the most provocative link in. This chain of suspicion comes from what's called the mud flood hypothesis. According to this idea, Tartaria didn't just lose a war or get absorbed into other empires. It was buried. Literally. A global disaster in the 1800s, not of water but of liquefied earth, swept across continents, swallowing cities and leaving only the upper floors of buildings visible above the new ground level. If such an event took place, the sudden disappearance of Tartaria from the maps could be seen as part of a broader effort to hide both the civilization and the catastrophe that destroyed it. Even without accepting the more extreme versions of the theory, the map record remains unsettling. Between the 1500s and 1800s, hundreds of independently produced European maps, often created by scholars and explorers working in rival empires, depict Tartaria in broadly the same way. These were not casual sketches. Some were made by official royal cartographers, others by renowned geographers whose work was considered authoritative in their day. The consistency is remarkable and not easily dismissed as mere artistic convention. When we leaf through these old charts now, they are more than antique curiosities. They are artifacts of a worldview that has been overwritten. In their scrollwork borders and ornate compass roses, they carry a silent question. If this vast land was once real enough to be drawn with such precision, how did it vanish so completely from our collective memory? Was it truly a phantom conjured by the limitations of early geography? Or was it something far more tangible? An empire whose story was deliberately cut short, its name erased as surely as a kingdom fallen to fire. The official record leans heavily toward the former, pointing to improved knowledge, shifting political boundaries, and the natural replacement of outdated terms. Yet, even historians admit that the scope of the erasure is unusual. And for those willing to look beyond the surface, those old maps become something else entirely. A breadcrumb trail leading to a vanished world. The IT is from here, between the inked certainty of the past and the blank spaces left behind, that the story of Tartaria begins to open. And in the next breath, it takes us down into the earth itself, to the buried streets and half-hidden facades that some believe are its last surviving monuments. Asterisk. Picture a thriving city, its streets alive with carriages, markets humming, towers and domes glinting in the sunlight. Then, without warning, the earth itself turns against it. Soil liquefies as if transformed into a rolling tide, surging through streets, swallowing storefronts, rising to windows, and finally hardening into a new, elevated ground level. What was once a front door now opens into a wall of compacted earth. Windows that once caught the morning light stare into darkness, buried beneath layers of packed mud and debris. This is the imagery at the heart of the mud flood hypothesis, a controversial theory that claims a global cataclysm in the mid to late 1800s buried entire cities beneath many feet of earth, not gradually over centuries, but in a single catastrophic sweep. Unlike a traditional flood, which carries water that eventually drains away, this disaster allegedly involved soil and sediment turning into a thick slurry. When it settled, it entombed buildings, leaving only their upper floors visible at what became the new street level. Proponents of the mud flood theory argue that we can still see its fingerprints today, if we know where to look. In cities across the world, you'll find architectural anomalies that mainstream history chalks up to urban development quirks. There are buildings where ground-level windows are half buried, where grand entryways lead directly into a wall of earth, or where ornate stone facades stand inexplicably in basements. Walk along certain streets in Edinburgh, Paris, Moscow, or San Francisco, and you'll see rows of windows at what appears to be sidewalk level, until you realize those basement windows were never meant to be underground at all. The theory's most famous examples come from Seattle in the United States. In the late 19th century, the city famously raised its street level after a series of devastating fires, building new roadways above the original ones. Today's Seattle Underground tours guide visitors through those preserved lower levels, entire blocks of Victorian-era buildings whose first floors are now underground, their entrances sealed, and their windows looking out into tunnels of darkness. The official explanation is straightforward. After the Great Fire of 1889, the city decided to elevate its streets to combat flooding and improve sanitation. Engineers simply built new roadways atop retaining walls, filled in the gaps, and connected the second floors of existing buildings to the new street level. But mud flood theorists see something different. They point to the uniformity of burial depth, the ornate craftsmanship of the submerged facades, and the global repetition of similar anomalies. They argue that raising streets by hand would have been a slow, localized process, yet across continents. We see nearly identical burials occurring within a few decades of each other. How could cities in Russia, America, Europe, and even parts of Asia have all decided to elevate their streets by 10 or more feet, all in roughly the same historical window? In New York City, subway excavations have revealed arches, masonry, and vaulted chambers far below current ground level, features that, some claim, bear the hallmarks of a more ancient, unified architectural style inconsistent with colonial-era building capabilities. In Paris, you can find whole stretches of the city where the original entrances are now subterranean, accessible only through narrow staircases descending from modern sidewalks. Mainstream historians and urban planners counter these claims by pointing to pragmatic reasons for such changes. Growing cities needed better drainage. Roads were raised to avoid flooding. Fires provided opportunities to rebuild in safer, more modern ways. They also note that building styles often repeated across regions, not because of a lost global empire, but because of shared design influences spread through trade, migration, and architectural training. Yet, for those who study old photographs and city plans, the anomalies are too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. They point to 19th century engravings showing bustling streets with no sign of construction, followed just a few years later by images of those same streets raised, their lower floors swallowed in darkness. And if you follow the timeline, something curious emerges. The height of these alterations coincides closely with the disappearance of Tartaria from maps that TO believers. This is no accident. They propose that the mud flood was either a natural disaster of unprecedented scale, triggered by massive earthquakes, planetary alignments, or solar plasma discharges, or a man-made cataclysm engineered to erase the infrastructure and memory of a sophisticated, pre-existing civilization. Once the mud settled, survivors would have been left with the upper stories of intact buildings, which could be repurposed by the new ruling powers. The lower levels, filled with sediment, would remain hidden, out of sight, out of mind. Photographic evidence fuels the intrigue. Early urban photography, though rare, sometimes shows construction workers digging through layers of earth to reveal buried doorways or windows perfectly preserved beneath the surface. In some cases, the detail and craftsmanship of these submerged portions surpass that of the visible upper floors, suggesting the basements were originally built to be above ground. There are even whispers of ancient engineering within these structures, ventilation systems, stonework precision, and design elements that seem anachronistic for their alleged 19th century builders. Critics argue that such interpretations are more about romantic imagination than hard evidence, but even they acknowledge the fascination of the pattern. From St. Petersburg to Salt Lake City, from Warsaw to Wellington, the ground seems to have risen over the past 2 centuries in a remarkably uniform way. The mud flood hypothesis stands at the intersection of archaeology, geology, and conspiracy theory. It challenges not only how we interpret historical disasters, but also how we define the flow of history itself. Was this burial the final act in erasing Tartaria, covering its cities in a shroud of earth before rewriting the maps? Or are we seeing nothing more than the accumulated byproducts of human engineering, urban renewal, and the slow layering of centuries? What is certain is that these buried facades are not isolated curiosities. They are a global phenomenon. And for those willing to question the official record, they are the first tangible clues pointing toward a story far older, and perhaps far stranger, than the one we've been told. Asterisk. If the mud flood hypothesis were confined to a handful of obscure ruins or forgotten villages, it might be easier to dismiss. But it's most compelling and unsettling. Examples are found not in the remote corners of the world, but in the beating hearts of modern cities. Take Seattle. Beneath the lively bustle of Pioneer Square, under the cafes, bars, and tourist shops, lies a preserved ghost of another city. The Seattle Underground feels like a time capsule, a network of sidewalks, storefronts, and cobblestone streets now entombed beneath the modern cityscape. Walking through it, you see windows looking out onto nothing but shadow, doorways that lead into solid earth, and facades adorned with ornate stonework that was never meant to be hidden. The official narrative says the city raised its streets after the Great Fire of 1889 to solve flooding and sanitation issues. Yet for mud flood theorists, the sheer scale and uniformity of the burial suggests something else, a cataclysmic event, sudden enough to demand rebuilding atop the remains rather than clearing them away. Shift to New York City. Beneath layers of asphalt and concrete, subway excavations have occasionally revealed something more than pipes and bedrock. Vaulted chambers, elaborate masonry, and stone arches reminiscent of European neoclassical design, deep below the level at which such features should exist. Mainstream history attributes these to early civic works or the basements of demolished buildings. Yet for those hunting signs of a lost civilization, the craftsmanship is suspiciously refined, especially given their depth and the apparent absence of supporting documentation about their construction. Then there's Chicago. The Great Fire of 1871 is said to have reduced large swaths of the city to ash, but mud flood enthusiasts note that many post-fire photographs show buildings that look far from destroyed, merely abandoned or partially buried. Some streets were raised by several feet in the decades before and after the fire, supposedly to improve drainage. But why the striking similarity in buried features? Arched windows now underground, entire floors turned into basements, when compared to Seattle, New York, or cities halfway around the world. Paris offers its own puzzle. In certain quarters, notably around the Marais and near the Seine, you can find building entrances that seem oddly low or sunken. Windows peek out just above sidewalk level, their ornate frames clearly designed for visibility, not concealment. The story here is that centuries of urban life, construction, demolition, rebuilding, have gradually raised the streets. Yet photographs from the 1800s show much the same configuration we see today, implying that the burial happened in one definitive change, not a slow sedimentation of time. St. Petersburg in Russia. often linked to Tartaria in these theories, is a treasure trove of such anomalies. The city's palatial facades, dripping with ornament, are often set several feet below street level, their ground floors functioning as basements despite their obvious decorative intent. Officially, this is a result of 18th and 19th century city planning, but the visual effect is eerily similar to that seen in American and Western European cities. What makes these examples so compelling to believers is their global uniformity. Across different climates, cultures, and political systems, we see the same architectural pattern: grand, ornate, expertly built lower levels now buried beneath our feet. Mainstream historians insist that such parallels are the product of similar needs: urban sanitation, protection from flooding, aesthetic trends, solved in similar ways. But to those who suspect a coordinated erasure of Tartaria, the odds of such widespread architectural coincidences are too small to ignore. There's also the matter of photographic evidence. In multiple cities, 19th century images show excavation sites where laborers dig through deep layers of earth to reveal perfectly preserved windows, arches, and even street lamps still affixed to what is now considered the basement level. In some cases, the quality of the submerged construction surpasses that of the upper floors, suggesting the upper sections may have been added later, after the lower levels were buried. Critics point out that the survival of such buried elements is not mysterious. Earth is an excellent preservative, and buildings often incorporate reused materials from earlier structures. But for the mud flood narrative, these lower levels aren't just well-preserved. They're stylistically consistent with each other across continents, as though they were the handiwork of one vast, interconnected civilization. When the puzzle pieces are laid out, Seattle's underground streets, New York's vaulted chambers, Chicago's raised roads, Paris's sunken windows, St. Petersburg's half-buried palaces, a pattern emerges. Not proof, perhaps, but a pattern. And patterns, in the eyes of those who distrust the official record, are rarely accidents. These buried architectural echoes may simply be the byproducts of urban evolution, or they could be the last surviving fingerprints of a civilization that was not meant to survive in our memory. Either way, they stand as silent witnesses to a history that refuses to stay buried, found not in crumbling ruins far away, but under the very streets we walk today. Asterisk if Tartaria's disappearance and the buried architecture beneath our feet were the only anomalies, the story might be strange enough. But to some researchers, these are not isolated mysteries. They are part of a repeating pattern that stretches far deeper into human history. This is where the narrative of Tartaria collides with the work of Graham Hancock and others who explore the possibility of ancient cataclysms wiping out advanced civilizations. Hancock's central thesis, most famously presented in Ancient Apocalypse, is that the timeline of human civilization is wrong. The official view, civilization as a linear climb from primitive hunter-gatherers to modern industrial societies, ignores evidence of a much older, more sophisticated culture that flourished during the Ice Age and was destroyed in a global catastrophe around 12,000 years ago. His work points to the Younger Dryas period, when sudden climate shifts, possibly triggered by a comet impact, melted vast ice sheets, raised sea levels, and flooded the world's coastlines. At first glance, the Ice Age floods and Tartaria's alleged mud flood seem worlds apart. One an ancient deluge, the other a relatively recent 19th century mystery. But for believers, the parallels are striking. Both involve sudden, devastating events that reshaped the landscape, erased vast amounts of knowledge, and left survivors to rebuild amid ruins. Both are followed by periods where the historical record seems oddly incomplete, as if the past had been deliberately edited. In Hancock's telling, sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, with its enormous T-shaped pillars carved over 11,000 years ago, demonstrate that hunter-gatherers possessed a level of skill, organization, and astronomical knowledge far beyond what mainstream archaeology attributes to them. He also highlights the Piri Reis map, a 16th century world map that appears to show the coastline of Antarctica without ice, long before modern exploration could have charted it. To Hancock, such evidence hints at a forgotten civilization with advanced capabilities. For mud flood theorists, this older, lost world could be an ancestor of Tartaria, a civilization that survived the Ice Age cataclysm, rebuilt, and eventually spread its influence across much of Eurasia. Over millennia, its technology, architecture, and knowledge might have degraded through repeated disasters until only fragments remained by the time of the 1700s. The 1800s mud flood, in this view, was simply the most recent and most decisive. Reset in a series of collapses that stretch back to prehistory. Hancock's ideas, like those of Tartaria researchers, face heavy criticism from academic circles. Archaeologists accuse him of cherry-picking evidence and ignoring data that contradicts his conclusions. Geological studies of supposed flood deposits often point to local events rather than global cataclysms, and many historians see the linking of far-flung sites and artifacts as romantic speculation rather than proof of a single, unified culture. Yet even skeptics admit that certain questions remain unanswered. How did cultures thousands of miles apart develop similar megalithic construction techniques? Why do myths from ancient Egypt, Sumer, and Mesoamerica all speak of a great flood and a golden age that ended in sudden ruin? And why, in the case of Tartaria, did maps from different nations agree so closely for centuries before the name vanished almost overnight? For those willing to entertain the possibility, the mud flood and Hancock's Ice Age catastrophe are part of the same rhythm, a cyclical rise and fall of civilizations, each more advanced than the last, each brought low by forces both natural and, perhaps, deliberate. The nature of those forces is the next question. Was the 19th century mud flood a freak geological event, a byproduct of cosmic disturbances? Or was it, as some claim, an engineered disaster designed to bury not just cities, but an entire chapter of human history? Hancock himself stops short of embracing the Tartaria narrative, but his work has undeniably emboldened those who do. By widening the scope of possible history, he's created space for alternative theories to take root, whether those theories point to comet strikes in the Ice Age or rivers of liquefied soil in the Victorian era. And so, the two stories, one ancient, one modern, begin to blur. If the Ice Age flood was the reset that wiped away an early global civilization, could Tartaria have been its descendant, erased in a smaller-scale replay of the same cosmic drama? And if that's the case, how many times has the cycle turned before? For believers, the mud flood is not merely an isolated mystery. It is a fresh scar in a landscape that has been reshaped countless times, a reminder that what we call history may be little more than the latest chapter in a very old, very incomplete book. Asterisk, once you begin looking for it, the so-called Tartarian style is hard to unsee. From the government palaces of St. Petersburg to the opera houses of Paris, from the state capitals of the American Midwest to the civic buildings of Melbourne and Buenos Aires, there's a striking aesthetic kinship, an architectural DNA that seems to leap across oceans and political borders. Towering domes, rows of fluted columns, arched windows crowned with intricate stone carvings, and masonry so precise that even modern contractors admit they'd struggle to replicate it without heavy machinery. Mainstream historians call this neoclassical or Beaux-Arts architecture, a style inspired by the grandeur of ancient Rome and Greece, spread globally through colonial expansion and industrial-era engineering. Yet for those who suspect a hidden history, the uniformity goes beyond style. It suggests a shared origin, a set of building principles and technologies inherited from a single, globalized civilization, one that modern nations merely inherited and rebranded. The argument hinges on more than visual similarity. In cities as far apart as San Francisco, Budapest, and Mumbai, the same proportional rules recur: symmetrical facades, grand central entrances aligned with a dome or tower, and geometric ornamentation echoing the ratios of sacred mathematics. In certain cases, even the stone-cutting techniques appear eerily alike: tight joints without mortar, blocks shaped to interlock in ways that distribute weight efficiently without visible reinforcement. Mudflood theorists go further, suggesting these buildings were not only aesthetically aligned but functionally connected, part of a network designed to harness and distribute energy. Some point to the presence of copper domes, iron spires, and elaborate metalwork as possible components of atmospheric electricity systems. The placement of certain buildings along supposed ley lines, a concept dismissed by mainstream science but beloved in alternative history circles, fuels speculation that these were not mere monuments, but active elements in a planet-wide grid. What makes the case more intriguing is the speed with which such structures appeared in the historical record. In the 19th century, cities that had been little more than frontier towns or colonial outposts seemed to sprout monumental civic buildings in a matter of years. The official story credits rapid industrialization, mass immigration, and a hunger to project cultural legitimacy. But skeptics ask, how did places with limited infrastructure and a shortage of skilled labor produce such feats so quickly and so consistently in the same style seen half a world away? In the United States, the Iowa State Capitol's towering dome and lavishly detailed interior rival anything in Europe, yet was built in what was still considered frontier territory at the time. In Melbourne, the Royal Exhibition building rose in the 1880s with such precision and grandeur that it was later named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace's monumental scale and ornate facades seem to belong to a civilization at the height of its powers. Yet official accounts place its construction in a city barely a century old at the time. For those following the Tartaria Trail, such coincidences are clues. They propose that much of this architecture was not built from scratch by the societies that claim it, but adapted from pre-existing structures left behind after the mud flood. A new ruling class might have cleared the debris, repaired what they could, and then declared the work their own. The same basic designs, columns, domes, arches, would appear everywhere because they were already everywhere, relics of a unified world before the reset. Of course, architectural historians push back. They point out that the global spread of European design was a conscious, documented effort during the colonial era, with architects trained in the same academies and working from the same pattern books. The use of domes and columns wasn't mysterious, it was fashionable. Industrial advances like steel framing and mechanized stone cutting allowed these designs to be built faster and more cheaply than ever before. Still, the sense of connection lingers. Walk into a grand railway station in Milan, and you might feel a strange déjà vu when you later stand beneath the vaulted ceilings of Union Station in Washington, D.C., stand before a 19th century courthouse in Argentina, and the symmetry, the ornament, the sense of deliberate proportion might call to mind the cathedrals of Russia or the palaces of Paris. Whether the explanation is cultural diffusion or something far more ancient, the effect is the same. A world where the most imposing symbols of authority share a common language in stone. For Tartaria's believers, that language is not the inheritance of Europe's Renaissance, but the fading dialect of an older civilization, one whose vocabulary survives in these monuments, even as their origins are buried beneath the stories we're told. And if the style is indeed a signature, then it may also be a map, pointing toward where that civilization's influence once reached, and perhaps where its last surviving secrets still lie. Step inside one of these grand old structures, the kind with marble staircases that seem to stretch like a giant's stride, and you may feel a subtle dissonance. The doors tower above you, their lintels reaching 15 feet or more. The windows rise in tall, narrow frames that would seem proportionate only if you were twice your current height. Even the furniture in some old photographs, chairs with unusually high seats, tables that stand at chest level, feels like it belongs to a different scale of being. Those intrigued by the Tartaria mystery. These are not merely architectural flourishes for the sake of grandeur. They are, perhaps, the lingering fingerprints of a civilization built by, or at least for, giants. In the 19th century, newspapers across the United States and Europe occasionally published breathless accounts of massive human skeletons unearthed during construction or mining. Reports described bones measuring 7 to 9 feet in height, with skulls far larger than modern averages. Such finds were allegedly whisked away by authorities or private collectors, often never seen again. The Smithsonian Institution, in particular, has been accused by conspiracy theorists of deliberately hiding or destroying giant remains, an accusation the institution firmly denies, attributing the stories to misidentified animal bones, hoaxes, or exaggeration by sensationalist newspapers. Yet the mythology of giants predates these tabloid tales by millennia. The Bible speaks of the Nephilim, mighty men of old who walked the earth before the Great Flood. Greek legends recount the Titans, colossal beings who shaped the world and clashed with the gods. Norse sagas are filled with Jotnar, giant warriors and builders. Native American oral histories tell of red-haired giants inhabiting mound cities. Their remains supposedly discovered in places like Nevada's Lovelock Cave for Tartaria believers. These myths are not isolated fantasies, but cultural memories of a real, global race of giant builders, possibly the very architects of the monumental structures we now attribute to the 18th and 19th centuries. In their view, the mud flood may have buried not only the works of these beings but evidence of their existence, allowing the inheriting powers to reshape history without contradiction. The architectural anomalies seem to bolster the case. Why? Would a city hall in the Midwest have an entrance 20 feet high? Why construct staircases with risers so tall that climbing them feels awkward to a modern human? Some suggest these design choices were for ceremonial effect, but others see them as simply functional for someone much taller than the average person today. There is also a technological angle. The same ornate buildings with giant-scaled features often exhibit stonework so precise and massive that, even with modern cranes and tools, reproducing it would be a challenge. To proponents of the giant builder theory, this hints at beings with both the physical capacity and advanced knowledge to manipulate such materials. Modern experiments in acoustic levitation and megalithic engineering, using sound waves or subtle vibrations to move heavy objects, are sometimes invoked as a possible link between these feats and the mysterious resonance technologies. Theorized to be part of Tartaria's legacy, skeptics, of course, counter each point. Architectural historians remind us that oversized features in civic buildings were common in the Beaux-Arts and neoclassical styles to project authority and inspire awe. They argue that human height has remained relatively stable over the centuries, with rare exceptions caused by medical conditions like gigantism, not a separate race of enormous humans. The alleged giant skeletons of the 1800s, they say, were more often the remains of large prehistoric animals misinterpreted by untrained eyes or outright fabrications by newspapers hungry for spectacle. And yet, the stories persist. Every so often, a photograph surfaces online of a construction site in the early 1900s showing workers dwarfed by massive bones, or a blurry image of an outsized skull said to have been found in a remote field. These are rarely verifiable, but they are compelling enough to keep the legend alive. Those steeped in Tartarian lore, the truth may lie somewhere between myth and masonry. Perhaps not all of Tartaria's architects were giants in the literal sense, but maybe they possessed knowledge and tools that allowed them to build on a scale that feels alien to us now. Or perhaps the legends of giants are symbolic, passed down through generations as metaphors for the stature of those who came before, a stature measured in capability, not height. Whatever the explanation, the feeling remains the same. When you stand in the shadow of a massive stone column, when you reach for a door handle well above your shoulder, you are reminded that the world we've inherited may have been shaped by hands, human or otherwise, very different from our own. Walk into the nave of a grand cathedral built in the 18th or 19th century, especially one of the great domed or vaulted halls often associated with Tartarian-style architecture, and speak at a normal volume. Your voice seems to lift from your chest and ripple outward, hanging in the air as if carried by an invisible hand. In certain spots, a whisper can be heard clearly across the room. In others, the sound seems to swell into a resonant hum that almost vibrates in your bones. To most visitors, this is simply beautiful acoustics, a happy marriage of stone, space, and symmetry. But to believers in Tartaria's lost technology, these spaces are far more than houses of worship or civic pride. They are machines. The theory goes like this. Many of these monumental buildings, cathedrals, opera houses, star forts, capitol domes, were designed with precise geometric ratios not only for aesthetic harmony, but for functional resonance. Just as a tuning fork vibrates at a specific frequency, these structures were supposedly tuned to the natural frequencies of the earth or the human body. In doing so, they could amplify sound, transmit energy, or even create levitation. Effects powerful enough to move massive stones into place. Some proponents point to cymatics, the study of visible sound vibration patterns, as a modern clue to what Tartarian builders might have known. In cymatic experiments, sand or liquid on a vibrating plate forms intricate geometric shapes when exposed to certain frequencies. The patterns often resemble the ornamental motifs carved into the stonework of Old World architecture: rosettes, spirals, interlocking circles. Coincidence? Or an encoded signature of how these buildings were meant to work? Theorists also note recurring features like copper-topped domes, metal spires, and strange finials that look decorative but may once have functioned as antennae, collecting atmospheric electricity and channeling it through the structure. Combined with resonance-based amplification, this could have created a rudimentary but powerful wireless energy system, lighting entire districts or powering machinery without the need for coal or gas. One of the most striking overlaps between Tartaria theory and conventional science is the concept of infrasound, sound waves below the range of human hearing. Studies show that infrasound can affect mood, perception, and even physical health. It can be generated naturally by wind, earthquakes, or ocean waves, but also deliberately by engineered spaces. Some Tartaria enthusiasts suggest that certain vaulted halls were designed to produce infrasound that could calm crowds, induce altered states, or facilitate healing. Functions that may have been as important to the builders as sermons or speeches. Skeptics respond with more grounded explanations. They argue that these acoustic properties are the result of trial-and-error craftsmanship, refined over centuries of church and theater design to enhance music and speech, not to tap into hidden energy fields. Copper domes and spires, they say, were chosen for durability and aesthetic impact, not for energy harvesting. And the resemblance between cymatic patterns and architectural ornamentation? Likely a case of convergent design, where similar shapes appear in both because they are visually pleasing and structurally effective. Still, the coincidences pile up. From Washington, D.C.'s Capitol Dome to the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, from star forts in Italy to the lavish opera houses of Eastern Europe, the same proportions and materials recur. Even their placement on the landscape sometimes aligns with ancient sacred sites, suggesting that location, orientation, and design were all part of a larger, deliberate system. The possibility that Tartaria, or a predecessor civilization, had mastered the marriage of sound and structure adds a tantalizing dimension to the mud flood mystery. If these buildings were indeed functional machines, then burying them in sediment would have done more than obscure their beauty. It would have silenced their song, cutting off whatever flow of energy they once channeled, and perhaps that, say, the believers, was the point. Picture the year 1898. You're standing in a quiet field at night when a shadow passes over the moon, vast, silent, and deliberate. Above you, an enormous airship glides through the darkness, its frame shimmering faintly in the starlight. It doesn't chug or roar like the early Zeppelins we've been taught about. Instead, it hums, softly, steadily, as if drawing power from the very air around it. Then, with an almost casual grace, it tilts toward a distant city, the copper spires of its tallest buildings catching the moon's reflection. The ship descends slowly, not to a ground-based hangar, but to a docking point atop a high dome. Its crew stepping out onto a platform hundreds of feet above the streets. Tartaria believers. This scene isn't fantasy. It's a glimpse into a forgotten reality. In their telling, airships were once a common sight, part of a global transportation network powered not by coal or gas, but by free atmospheric energy. These vessels, they argue, could traverse continents without refueling, hovering with perfect stability and docking at specially designed high points on buildings that we still see today. The key to such a system, they say, lies in a technology we know fragments of through the work of Nikola Tesla. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Tesla demonstrated methods of wireless power transmission, tapping into what he believed was a limitless reservoir of energy in the Earth's atmosphere. His famous Wardenclyffe Tower was intended to broadcast electricity around the globe without wires, a project abruptly halted, many believe, because it threatened the business models of energy barons like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller. Tartaria. Enthusiasts suggest Tesla was not inventing from scratch, but rediscovering principles that the Tartarian Empire had once mastered. They point to recurring architectural features, especially tall spires topped with metal finials, copper domes, and geometric ornamentation that could have served as energy receivers or transmitters. In this theory, the same structures that collected energy for lighting and heating buildings could also power fleets of airships through resonant, wireless transfer. Supporting evidence, they argue, can be found in old photographs that show impossibly large airships over cities in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Images often dismissed as hoaxes or mislabeled experimental craft. Some patents from the era, tucked away in archives, describe propulsion systems involving electromagnetic fields, ionized gases, and lightweight metal alloys far beyond the capacity of most early aviation designs. Skeptics counter with a more mundane view. Yes, airships existed, but they were slow, unwieldy, and prone to disaster, as the Hindenburg tragedy proved. They note that Tesla's wireless energy experiments never reached a stage where large-scale power delivery was demonstrated, and that the supposed docking points on buildings are more plausibly explained as decorative flourishes or observation decks. Yet the mystery deepens when we look at how quickly enthusiasm for airships evaporated in the public sphere. By the mid-20th century, development of large dirigibles had all but ceased, replaced by airplanes requiring vast amounts of fuel. Was this simply the triumph of faster technology, or was it the deliberate sidelining of a cleaner, more sustainable transport system? The free energy aspect of Tartarian lore goes even further. Advocates claim that crystal-based technology, using quartz and other piezoelectric materials, was central to the civilization's power grid. These crystals, when placed under pressure or exposed to certain frequencies, could generate and amplify electrical energy. Integrated into buildings, they could store and release this power for lighting, heating, communication, or propulsion. But there's an eerie alignment here with legends from other lost civilizations. Atlantis supposedly powered its cities with crystal energy. Lemurian myths speak of sunstones that captured and distributed light. In some Native American traditions, high peaks containing large quartz deposits are sacred, places where the sky speaks to the earth. If true, the implications are enormous. Airships and entire cities could have run on ambient energy drawn from the atmosphere, with no pollution and minimal cost. The erasure of Tartaria, in this view, wasn't just about wiping away cultural memory, it was about destroying a working example of a post-scarcity energy system before it could threaten the profits of emerging industrial empires. Whether you see them as an echo of suppressed genius or simply the fever dream of internet forums, the images linger. Massive, silent airships gliding over copper-domed skylines, tethered not to fuel tanks or coal bins, but to the hidden heartbeat of the Earth itself. And if even a fraction of that was possible, then burying Tartaria's story was not just about controlling history. It was about controlling the future. Asterisk across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia, a strange architectural pattern repeats itself. Sprawling geometric fortifications shaped like stars, with multiple angled bastions radiating outward like points on a compass rose. They're called star forts in conventional history, a military innovation developed in the Renaissance to withstand cannon fire. Their angled walls and low, thick ramparts allowed defenders to cover all approaches with overlapping lines of fire. That's the official story. But to those exploring Tartarian lore, the star fort is more than a clever military design. It's a signature of a vanished energy network. The geometry is the first clue. Star forts are laid out with extraordinary precision, their proportions conforming to sacred mathematics, golden ratios, symmetrical polygons, and alignments that match not just topography, but sometimes celestial events. In some cases, they seem to have been positioned with the same care ancient cultures used for temples and megaliths, aligning with solstices, equinoxes, or magnetic anomalies. Believers argue that these geometric designs weren't just for defense. They were functional components of an energy system. In this view, the bastions and angled walls acted like antenna arrays, capturing and directing natural electromagnetic currents along the Earth's ley lines. Some go further, suggesting they could focus these energies for multiple purposes: powering buildings, maintaining atmospheric stability for airship travel, or even creating localized protective fields. There's a tantalizing detail that fuels these claims. Star forts exist in places where no major historical battles ever occurred, sometimes far from any significant military frontier. Why build such elaborate fortifications where they would never be tested? And why are so many of them remarkably well preserved, as though they were abandoned rather than destroyed? The sheer scale of the network is another mystery. From Fort Bourtange in the Netherlands to the vast citadel of Alessandria in Italy, from Fort Monroe in Virginia to star-shaped earthworks in India and Africa, their global distribution spans continents and cultures. Mainstream historians explain this through the spread of European military engineering during colonial expansion. But for Tartaria enthusiasts, the consistency is too complete, the precision too uniform, to be the product of dozens of unrelated military projects. Inside some star forts, the layout is even stranger. Central courtyards with perfect radial symmetry, underground tunnels, and sometimes wells or cisterns placed exactly at the geometric center. To believers, these features could have been energy collection nodes or resonators, designed to concentrate natural forces for use in nearby cities. The central points, they claim, may have once housed tall structures, spires, towers, or even crystal arrays that have since been dismantled or replaced. Skeptics counter that the uniformity is simply the result of a shared engineering tradition, codified in military manuals and replicated wherever European powers built forts. They point out that alignments with ley lines or astronomical events can appear coincidental when enough examples are examined. And they note that no definitive evidence of energy collection or transmission systems has ever been found in these sites. Still, certain anomalies persist. Modern researchers with electromagnetic field detectors have recorded unusual readings at some star forts, especially during geomagnetic storms. In rare cases, compasses spin erratically within their walls. While such occurrences could have natural explanations, iron in the soil, interference from underground cables, they add a layer of intrigue for those already inclined to suspect hidden purposes if the star forts were indeed part of a global Tartarian network. Their design might have served dual purposes, outwardly as military strongholds, inwardly as energy machines. When the mud flood and other reset events buried or disrupted the network, their original function was lost, leaving behind only the impressive stonework and a carefully edited explanation in the history books. Today, most star forts are tourist attractions, their moats turned into gardens and their bastions into scenic viewpoints. But for those chasing Tartaria's ghost, they are more than relics. They are the blueprints of a civilization that may have once mastered the Earth's hidden currents, and perhaps, just perhaps, left the knowledge encoded in stone for anyone curious enough to decipher it. Asterisk between the mid-1800s and early 1900s, an unsettling chapter in history unfolded in North America. Trains filled with children, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, left the crowded cities of the East Coast, bound for rural towns in the Midwest and beyond. These journeys became known as the Orphan Train movement. The official narrative says this was a charitable program. Overcrowded urban orphanages, they explain, were emptied by placing children with farm families who could offer them a fresh start. The Children's Aid Society and other philanthropic organizations are credited with rescuing street kids from poverty, crime, and neglect. But in the Tartarian narrative, this story takes on a much darker tone. According to believers, the orphan trains were not just about helping destitute children. They were about repopulating territories after a massive depopulation event. They point to the suspicious timing. The trains began operating in earnest shortly after the mud flood period, as Tartaria researchers dated, and they continued for decades. These children, they claim, may not have been orphans in the traditional sense. They might have been survivors, children separated from their parents during a cataclysm, or even taken from broken Tartarian communities to be raised under a new narrative. Here's where it gets even more unsettling: the sheer scale. Historians estimate that between 200,000 and 250,000 children were relocated in this manner. Many were so young they couldn't remember their origins, and their names were often changed upon arrival. Records were scant, and in many cases, non-existent. The children were lined up at train depots and chosen by locals, sometimes for adoption, but often as laborers, effectively indentured servants. In rural communities, these newcomers often had no shared language or heritage with the families who took them in. Some accounts from the time describe children with unusual physical features or foreign mannerisms, prompting speculation among Tartaria enthusiasts that they may have come from distant lands or entirely different cultural backgrounds than the host towns. The theory deepens when tied to global parallels. Around the same period, Australia saw the forced relocation of children in what's now called the stolen generations, and Britain ran child migration schemes to Canada and other colonies. 2. Believers, these were not isolated humanitarian programs. They were coordinated population transfers designed to erase old identities and integrate survivors into the new world order. Why children? Tartaria theorists say they were easier to mold, easier to strip of historical memory, and could be raised to accept the rewritten version of history without question. If entire adult populations had been lost or removed, then children were the quickest way to seed new communities without the baggage of old allegiances. Critics, of course, see these claims as speculative at best, conspiratorial at worst. They point out that urban poverty in the 19th century was severe, that orphanages were overwhelmed, and that relocating children was a genuine attempt to improve lives, however imperfect. Abuse and exploitation certainly occurred, they admit, but as a byproduct of lax oversight, not a secret depopulation agenda. Still, a few unsettling details linger. Old photographs of the orphan trains often show children in neat rows, dressed in matching clothes, their expressions blank or wary. In many cases, there are no records of their parentage, no way to trace where they came from. When they grew up, many never learned their true origins. For Tartaria believers, the orphan trains are one more thread in a web of evidence. After the Great Resets, the cities had to be repopulated, the workforce replenished, and the memory of the old world erased. The best way to do that was to start with the youngest. Those who could grow up never knowing what came before. It's a haunting idea. The echo of wheels on steel rails, the lurch of a train pulling away from the station, and hundreds of young faces pressed to the glass, watching the world they knew fade into a blur, forever replaced by a story someone else would write for them. Star. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the great world's fairs dazzled the public with sprawling, ornate cities built seemingly overnight. These events, from Chicago's 1893 Columbian Exposition to San Francisco's 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition, showcased monumental architecture, vast plazas, and gleaming domes and spires, many of them in the grand Beaux-Arts style, dripping with ornamentation and classical detail. The official story says these were temporary constructions, built to impress visitors and then torn down afterward because they were made of inexpensive staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp fiber that wouldn't last. The exhibitions themselves were intended to display industrial progress, artistic achievement, and cultural exchange. But to followers of Tartarian theory, these fairs are smoking guns. The claim goes like this: these weren't purpose-built sets, thrown together for a few months of spectacle. They were pre-existing remnants of the old world, revealed briefly before being demolished under the cover of temporary status. In other words, the fairs weren't built for the exposition. They were disguised as expositions to explain away the sudden appearance of monumental, advanced architecture that didn't fit the accepted timeline. The Chicago World's Fair alone featured over 200 grand buildings, connected by wide boulevards and canals, with massive statues, electrified fountains, and a central court of honor dominated by the 250-foot-high administration building. For a city supposedly still recovering from the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the sheer speed and scale of the project raises eyebrows. How could they design, construct, and fully decorate such vast and intricate structures in just a couple of years, using what was allegedly cheap plaster on wood frames? Believers argue that this staff explanation is misleading, that the structures were already there, made of durable stone and steel, and only given cosmetic touch-ups for the fair. Once the public had seen them, they were destroyed to prevent future generations from asking questions about their origins. The destruction itself fuels suspicion. After each fair, these magnificent cities, complete with infrastructure, landscaping, and working utilities, were deliberately razed. Some were even burned in massive fires under suspicious circumstances, as in the case of the 1910 Brussels International Exhibition Grounds. In mainstream history, the demolition is explained by cost. Maintaining these massive buildings wasn't practical once the event ended. But for Tartaria enthusiasts, it's evidence of an intentional purge. They also point to the uniformity of the architecture. From St. Louis to Paris to Melbourne, the exposition sites all shared the same monumental style: grand domes, colonnades, triumphal arches, regardless of local architectural traditions. Was this simply the influence of the global beaux-arts trend, or a sign of a single, advanced civilization whose cities had been repurposed for these fairs? Electric lighting plays a role in the mystery as well. At the 1893 Chicago Fair, visitors were awed by the White City, brilliantly illuminated by alternating current supplied by Westinghouse and Tesla. For many, it was their first experience with electric light on such a scale. Tartaria theorists suggest the fairs may have been demonstrations of a rediscovered technology, possibly even remnants of an older, free energy grid still partially functioning in those buildings. The strange thing is how quickly the fairs faded from collective memory. While photographs survive, the events themselves are rarely discussed outside of architectural or historical circles. For believers, this is deliberate, a way to keep people from asking why entire cities of splendor appeared and vanished within a year or two. If the Tartarian interpretation is correct, the world's fairs were the final public display of old world grandeur before it was wiped away. A carefully staged performance where the past was repackaged as a temporary fantasy, then bulldozed into oblivion, leaving only the photos, the postcards, and the gnawing question: what kind of civilization could build like that, and why was it erased? Asterisk. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a wave of massive urban fires swept across North America and Europe. The official accounts describe them as the tragic but natural result of wooden construction, poor firefighting infrastructure, and the occasional freak weather condition. But to followers of the Tartarian narrative, these fires were far too frequent, far too destructive, and far too conveniently timed to be mere accidents. One of the most cited examples is the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. The mainstream story blames a dry season, strong winds, and, famously, a cow kicking over a lantern in Mrs. O'Leary's barn. The blaze supposedly spread rapidly, consuming over 17,000 buildings in 2 days. But Tartaria theorists see something else: a city filled with imposing stone and brick structures, many of them with domes, arches, and columns in the old world style, reduced to rubble in a suspiciously thorough fashion. They question how a fire could level so many stone buildings, leaving only empty shells and piles of ash. Chicago wasn't alone. In the same year, fires struck Peshtigo, Wisconsin, killing thousands in what remains the deadliest fire in U.S. history, and Boston, Massachusetts. The coincidence of timing, 3 major urban fires in different cities in the same season, raises eyebrows in Tartarian circles. Some suggest these were coordinated resets designed to wipe away the architecture of the old world while blaming nature. The phenomenon continued. The Great Seattle Fire of 1889 destroyed the city's central business district. The San Francisco Fire of 1906, following the earthquake, obliterated swaths of old world architecture. Yet photographic evidence shows that many grand buildings remained standing after the quake, only to be consumed in the days-long fires that followed. Were the blazes an unfortunate side effect of disaster, or a deliberate cleanup? Theorists point to patterns. Fires often started in multiple locations at once. They sometimes occurred under conditions that seem unlikely for such rapid spread. Entire city blocks of stone structures would be gutted, as if exposed to extreme heat beyond normal combustion. Some link the destruction to directed energy or chemical accelerants, suggesting advanced technology, either from the old world itself or wielded by those seeking to erase it, may have been involved. Others tie it to the larger mud flood theory, proposing that once half-buried cities were excavated, they needed to be destroyed before too many questions were asked, and always, the aftermath followed the same script. The ruins were cleared, The street grid sometimes altered, and the replacement architecture was built in a more standardized, less ornate style. What had been towering domes and carved facades became plainer, boxier buildings, easier to construct, but also easier to forget. Officially, these urban infernos are tragic coincidences in a dangerous era. But for Tartaria believers, they look like the erasure of an inconvenient past. Cities wiped clean, their old-world grandeur reduced to smoke, ash, and a blank canvas for the history books to rewrite. It's a chilling thought that the orange glow on the horizon wasn't just a disaster. It was the deliberate burning away of an entire civilization's fingerprints. Between the 1850s and the 1920s, an unusual social program unfolded across the United States. Known as the Orphan Train movement, it involved transporting tens of thousands, some say hundreds of thousands, of children from crowded eastern cities to rural towns in the Midwest and beyond. Officially, the goal was noble: remove impoverished, abandoned, or homeless children from dangerous urban streets and place them with farm families who could give them a fresh start. The narrative sounds compassionate. But to Tartaria researchers, the scale, timing, and mystery surrounding these children hint at something stranger and darker. From the official records, between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 200,000 plus children were relocated. Most were said to be orphans of immigrant families who died in epidemics or couldn't care for them. Yet eyewitness accounts from the time reveal something unsettling. Many of the children didn't seem to be infants or toddlers abandoned in cities. They were often older, well-spoken, and, strangely, unable to provide clear details about their parents or origins. The logistics also raise questions. In an era without modern transport coordination, how were so many children processed, housed, and moved long distances on such a consistent basis? Who paid for the massive operation? And why were rural families often told very little about where the children came from? The Tartarian interpretation suggests these weren't merely orphans in the conventional sense. They may have been survivors of a recently collapsed old-world civilization, children whose parents perished or disappeared during the so-called mud flood or related global upheavals. With entire cities supposedly wiped out or repopulate, these children might have been gathered from depopulated areas and redistributed to prevent large clusters of survivors from speaking openly about their origins. Consider the timing. The peak years of the Orphan Trains overlap closely with the period when massive, great fires and alleged mud floods were reshaping cities. If these events erased much of the old population, who would be left? The children. And placing them into new families would effectively overwrite their cultural memory within a generation. There's also the curious fact that photographs of these orphans, rows upon rows of neatly dressed, solemn-faced children, show them wearing clothes that appear surprisingly well-made for supposed street waifs. Some have suggested these outfits were remnants of a higher standard of living before their displacement, not hand-me-downs from charity bins. Even more intriguing is how quickly the Orphan Train program faded from public consciousness. For such a massive social experiment, it receives little attention in history classes today, and when it is discussed, it's framed as an act of kindness rather than a mysterious mass relocation that reshaped the demographics of rural America. Whether viewed as benevolence or something more calculated, the Orphan Trains represent a historical gap, a period where thousands of young lives were uprooted, their pasts erased, and their futures redirected. For believers in the Tartarian reset, this was no accident. It was population management on a scale few people realize, ensuring that any surviving memory of the old world would be carried away on steel rails and quietly forgotten. Asterisk from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, cities across the globe hosted massive world's fairs, international expositions that dazzled millions with grand architecture, technological marvels, and elaborate cultural exhibits. The official story frames them as temporary events, built to celebrate progress and inspire the public. But to those who study the Tartarian narrative, these fairs were more than just festivals. They were showcases of old-world architecture, and perhaps cover-ups for its dismantling. The scale was staggering. Consider the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, 1893. Spread across more than 600 acres, it featured vast, temporary palaces, gleaming white neoclassical buildings, domes, and colonnades that looked like they belonged to ancient Rome or Imperial Europe. According to history, these ornate structures were made of cheap plaster and wood, only meant to last the fair's 6 months before being demolished. Yet photographs show an incredible level of craftsmanship, with intricate detailing, massive pillars, and immense halls that seem far beyond the capabilities of quick-build crews using turn-of-the-century tools. It wasn't just Chicago. The 1900 Paris Exposition, the 1910 Brussels International Exhibition, the 1897 Tennessee Centennial Exposition in Nashville. Each featured enormous complexes in the Beaux-Arts or neoclassical style, filled with fountains, statues, and electric lighting that amazed visitors. And yet, in most cases, the buildings were torn down immediately after the fairs ended, leaving little trace except photographs and postcards. The mainstream explanation? The materials were temporary, and the cost of upkeep was too high. The Tartarian counter theory? Many of these buildings were already there, relics of a previous civilization, and the fairs were staged as a grand, last showing before demolition. By framing them as temporary installations, the organizers could destroy priceless old-world architecture without raising suspicion. Supporters of the theory point to several oddities. Speed of construction. Official timelines often claim that dozens of massive buildings were built from scratch in a year or two. Yet comparable permanent buildings today can take far longer. Quality of design. The level of artistry and engineering seems inconsistent with the idea of disposable plaster shells. Mysterious destruction, fires, floods, and deliberate demolition frequently followed these events, erasing all evidence. Global pattern. The same architectural style and rapid erasure appeared across continents, as if following a coordinated script. Some even argue that the fairs served a psychological purpose, to introduce the new history to the masses. Visitors would marvel at the wonders, be told they were recent creations, and leave with a reinforced belief in humanity's upward progress, never realizing they might have been walking through the remnants of a far older, more advanced civilization after. Each fair, the supposed temporary palaces vanished, replaced by more modest and practical structures. Bit by bit, the visual memory of the old world was scrubbed away. And so, for Tartaria researchers, the world's fairs weren't just celebrations of modernity. They were the final curtain call for a civilization already erased from the official record. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, an uncanny pattern emerges in historical records. Massive citywide fires erupting in some of the fastest-growing, architecturally rich urban centers in North America and beyond. Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, Toronto, Seattle, Baltimore, the list goes on. Each fire followed a disturbingly similar script. Start suddenly, spread with unnatural speed, annihilate the most ornate downtown districts, and leave behind a blank slate for modern rebuilding. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 is perhaps the most famous. According to legend, it began when Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern. In just 2 days, over 17,000 buildings were destroyed, most of them made from materials that should have resisted such rapid, total destruction. Firefighters reported walls exploding outward and entire blocks igniting at once, as if the flames had an unusual intensity. In Boston, 1872, the fire swept through downtown in a similar fashion, leveling dozens of grand stone and brick buildings in mere hours. The Great Seattle Fire, 1889, supposedly started when a pot of glue boiled over in a carpentry shop, yet it razed the entire central business district. San Francisco, meanwhile, experienced not one but multiple catastrophic fires, culminating in the 1906 fire, which followed a major earthquake. While the quake receives most of the blame, contemporary photographs reveal widespread damage in areas untouched by seismic collapse, suggesting that fire, not shaking, did the real erasing. Tartaria researchers see these great fires not as random accidents, but as strategic events to destroy old-world architecture, particularly the kind built with impossible-to-replicate stonework, towering facades, and mysterious domed structures. In many cases, these cities already had grand civic buildings, train stations, and cathedrals that looked centuries older than the official founding dates. After the fires, reconstruction ushered in more utilitarian architecture, simpler, cheaper, and stripped of ornate details. There are several recurring anomalies. Coincidental timing. Many fires occurred within a few decades of each. Other, during the same era that saw orphan trains, world's fairs, and mass rewritings of history. Selective destruction. The most elaborate downtown areas were destroyed, while less significant outskirts often survived. A rapid cleanup. Rubble from stone and brick structures was swiftly cleared, sometimes within weeks, as if prepared in advance. Photographic evidence. Pre-fire images often show highly advanced architecture, while post-fire rebuilding appears more primitive in style and materials. Some theorists suggest that advanced old-world buildings may have contained materials, technologies, or records that did not fit the emerging narrative of the industrial age. By removing them, whether through actual fire or controlled demolition masked as disaster, the authorities could reshape the cultural memory of entire cities that eye in official history. These fires are framed as tragic but natural setbacks, reminders of the perils of wooden construction and crowded streets. In the Tartarian interpretation, they were something else entirely, a coordinated wave of erasures, ensuring that by the dawn of the 20th century, the old world's physical presence would be reduced to scattered photographs and fading memories. And so, with each great fire, another piece of the puzzle was incinerated, until the world we know today could rise, unchallenged by the stone and steel ghosts of the civilization that came before. Asterisk from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, a strange chapter unfolded in North America, one that the official story treats as a benevolent charity movement, but which Tartaria researchers view as a critical part of the Great Reset. This was the era of the Orphan Trains, vast relocation programs that transported hundreds of thousands of children from eastern cities to rural communities across the United States and Canada. The mainstream narrative says this began in 1854 when charitable organizations like the Children's Aid Society sought to save homeless children from dangerous urban streets. Special trains carried these children westward, where they were adopted by farming families in need of labor or longing for children. On paper, it sounds heartwarming, but deeper scrutiny reveals disturbing questions. First, the scale. Estimates suggest that between 200,000 and 250,000 children were moved over a span of about 75 years. This number is staggering, especially considering the smaller populations of the time. Where did so many orphans come from? Records of their origins are often vague or missing, with many children unable to recall their families or even their real names. Second, the timing. The orphan train era overlaps precisely with the period when many cities experienced the Great Fires, the demolition of old-world architecture, and the apparent repopulation of areas after a supposed reset. To some researchers, the connection is obvious. The children weren't simply orphans in the conventional sense. They were the surviving population of a depopulated world, possibly brought in from other regions or even other continents to reseed communities. Third, the distribution process raises ethical red flags. Orphan train arrivals were often treated like auctions. Children would be lined up in town squares or churches, inspected for health and strength, and then chosen by families. While some found loving homes, others became unpaid laborers or servants. There was minimal oversight and no comprehensive tracking of where the children went or how they were treated. Photographs from the time are equally strange. Groups of children stand in orderly rows, often dressed in identical or nearly identical clothing, as if part of a uniformed population transfer. Their expressions range from vacant to wary, and the absence of parents or familiar faces adds to the eerie atmosphere. Tartaria theorists argue that these were not isolated adoptions, but part of a massive human redistribution program. Some suggest the children could have been brought from other countries whose populations had been decimated, explaining why some rural families reported receiving children who spoke entirely different languages. Others believe they were survivors of orphanages emptied after disasters, or the descendants of a once advanced culture being quietly absorbed into the New World Order. In the official record, the orphan trains are remembered as a humanitarian effort that gave many children a second chance. But to those looking at the larger pattern, the empty cities, the fires, the world's fairs, the trains take on a different meaning. They were the lifeblood of a repopulation campaign, a way to refill the map with new faces while erasing the true origins of a lost generation. By the early 20th century, the orphan train movement slowed, replaced by modern foster systems. But by then, the damage, or the plan, was done. The children had been scattered, their pasts dissolved, and with them, perhaps, the last living memories of the old world had vanished into the folds of the new history. Between 1851 and the early 20th century, a series of colossal expositions, known as World's Fairs or Expositions Universelles, appeared across the globe, seemingly overnight. Officially, these events were showcases of industrial progress and cultural exchange, featuring magnificent pavilions, palaces, and monuments. But for those who study Tartarian history, they represent something far stranger: the public display and final dismantling of Old World architecture and technology. Take the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. It covered 690 acres, featured more than 200 buildings, and dazzled visitors with grand neoclassical architecture, intricate domes, and vast waterways. The structures looked ancient yet immaculate: temples, palaces, and halls on a scale that even modern construction would struggle to replicate in such a short time. The official explanation is that these were temporary plaster and lath constructions, designed to be torn down afterward. But the speed, precision, and grandeur of the build strained credibility. How do you throw together entire cityscapes in less than 2 years without modern machinery? Chicago was not unique. Paris, 1889, 1900, St. Louis, 1904, San Francisco, 1915, and other host cities all produced similarly jaw-dropping complexes, each containing multiple massive, temporary palaces, arcades, fountains, and monumental gates. Photographs show perfectly proportioned classical columns, ornate statuary, and sprawling gardens, designs that echo old-world aesthetics found in the so-called Tartarian buildings still scattered across Europe and Asia. The Tartarian interpretation suggests that these fairs were not constructed from scratch, but staged within existing remnants of the old world, perhaps partially restored or reskinned to match the theme of the exposition. After the events concluded, many of the structures were demolished or burned in mysterious fires, leaving little trace for future generations. Several anomalies feed this suspicion. Instant cities, vast, intricate layouts supposedly, built in under 2 years, then dismantled almost immediately, as if to prevent deeper study. Strange technology displays. World's fairs often showcased electric lighting, moving sidewalks, massive pipe organs, and other marvels. Yet, these technologies sometimes wouldn't become commonplace for decades afterward. Architectural consistency across continents. The style and scale of these fairs remained eerily similar, as if drawing from the same unknown blueprint. Destruction after glory. In nearly every case, the grandest structures were destroyed, with official records claiming maintenance was too costly for temporary buildings. Some researchers believe these fairs were reprogramming events, ways to introduce the public to a new historical narrative while simultaneously erasing physical evidence of the old one. Visitors would marvel at the newly built wonders, accept the official explanation of their origin, and then watch them vanish, cementing the idea that such grandeur belonged only to the past or to fantasy. Others speculate that the fairs were part of a global redistribution of artifacts and technology. Massive shipments of statuary, furniture, machines, and even entire facades were recorded as being moved between expositions, as if the organizers were quietly collecting, cataloging, and relocating the remnants of a fallen civilization. By the early 20th century, the era of monumental World's Fairs began to fade. Their architectural legacy was almost entirely gone, save for a handful of surviving structures, like the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco or the Eiffel Tower in Paris, which stand as lonely monuments to an age of impossible grandeur. To the casual tourist, these fairs were a celebration of human progress. To those who suspect a hidden history, they were the final public parades of the old world, before the curtains fell and the last great structures of Tartaria were consigned. to memory.